Now it's a real pleasure of mine to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Susan Reichle. Susan's official title is Counselor to USAID, which means she's very senior in the organisation, which is why it's very, very important for integrated development that she's here. But she actually has a 25-year distinguished career with the US government, and I want to list some of her accomplishments. She served in Haiti, where she actually guided USAID's response to the Haiti earthquake. She served in Nicaragua and Russia. She was mission director at the US Embassy in Colombia, where she received several awards from the Colombian government for her leadership. And she was deputy coordinator in the Department of State's Office for Reconstruction and Stabilization. She has a master's degree in national security from the National War College, 2 master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in international development, and a BA in international relations from James Madison University. But my favourite thing about Susan is a comment she made recently, which I'm hoping she'll expand on a little in her comments to us. She said, and I quote, "Women's empowerment isn't just part of development, it's the core of development." And I would add to that, women's empowerment is also the core of integrated development. Susan, we're very excited to hear what you have to say about that and the role of the US government, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful player on the international development stage, what you have to say about the future of integrated development. Susan.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see everybody here, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. You know, I always wondered what quote and where did that come from, but that one was really near and dear to my heart because I had a good fortune of talking about gender empowerment recently. And just to share with you, because I know all of you have been here all day, and this is the end of the day, and I can tell from this group you probably had just a great discussion and moving this important topic forward. But downtown, there's another event going on. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition is hosting an all-day event with people in from all over the country who care about development. And those of you who know the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, they're kind of called the Strange Bedfellows Coalition. So because they have everything from people from the military, from the private sector, diplomacy, development, everybody who cares about the 150 account. And as they were doing a closing session, we had the leadership of some of the major foreign assistance leaders up there on stage, and they were all women. So, and Gail Smith was obviously there from USAID, and Dana Hyde from the MCC, Carrie Hessler. Anyway, I just had to share that because I think that's a unique snippet. So we're here to talk a little bit, and I just wanted to be with you today to chat a bit about integrated development and what it means for us at USAID. And it's so wonderful to see so many partners and old friends here, because this is an issue that many of you know is not new, but I do hope that you get a sense from USAID that it is rising and has risen to very much the top of our agenda. Now, not new in the sense, because obviously, in seeing some old friends, I see Debbie Kennedy back there, and she remembers when we had strategic objective teams in our missions, and the whole point of that was to get people together from integrated, from different places in a mission to really integrate and talk about it. That was the 1990s, right? So this is something clearly we have cared about for some time. But we also really have made it a priority, particularly under this administration. Our policies, if you look at all of our policies that have come out of the agency over the last 7 years, one of the core principles that you'll see throughout is integration. And that we're not going to get there if we do not really look at development through an integrated lens. And all of you know this because whether you're a health officer, an education officer, a DRG officer, wherever you're technical, wherever you align technically, we know when you're going out to meet with a mayor, to meet with a governor, to really solve a challenge within the community, that there's not one silver bullet. There's not one solution. And so that in order for us to really drive towards the issue of sustainability, which is what all of us care so deeply about, and for it to be locally owned, you cannot separate the issue of integration. That it's absolutely core to achieving local sustainable development. And then finally, for our donors who are here as well, obviously it has risen very much to the top of the agenda, and whether it's the work that the OECD is doing, or just in general, you were talking a lot about the SDGs today, I hope, that we're not going to, as a global community, achieve the SDGs unless all of us are truly looking at development through an integrated lens. So, clearly this is something we all know to be true, but what have we learned? And I'm just going to share with you a bit of what we've learned over the last several years in particular, and then also, most importantly, what are some of the examples? What do we see that's really working well? And also, I hope, and I'd love to hear from you when we go to Q&A, what's also not working well? What have we learned from our failures? Because it's okay to fail in development. We have to take risks. And integrated development, there is some risk-taking involved. So then what did we learn from that? Well, obviously, one of our top-line lessons, and particularly, I really do want to do a shout-out to the DRG team, who has been leading the way on this, particularly bringing it to the forefront over the last couple of years. Because as we launched our DRG strategy in 2013, one of the core elements of that strategy was integration. And it wasn't just in our strategy, but most importantly, we then went out and we did the research. We did the 6 case studies. We looked at what are we learning from taking integration to the next level. And one of the first things, not surprisingly, is leadership matters. It matters who's in charge of that mission or that project, and that the leadership is really talking about it not through one sectoral lens, but really getting the teams together, because we might think that we're sharing. And I think there's a real difference between coordinating and integrating. Coordinating is when you're all sitting in the room. You might all know what's happening geographically. Integrating is when you're really problem solving. You're saying this community is dealing with this challenge and moving forward. So leadership, obviously, absolutely key. Second, we have to build this from the start. We can't think about it down the line. It has to be built into our country development cooperation strategies, into our project designs, and being really intentional about it. And I know all of you as partners, what do you do when you look at an RFA or an RFP coming out, hopefully a BAA where we really are doing the coordination? We have to be intentional about it, and we have to build it in from the start. And for all of us, looking at the criteria of how we will make those awards. Adaptive management. I understand you've talked about the importance of flexibility. You have Ben here and hopefully has shared, I'm sure, a lot of the experience of how do we build in the adaptive management and the flexibility. You're going to see our new policy coming out very soon on the whole program cycle, getting back to my earlier point about building it into the strategy, the design, and evaluation, that being very, very intentional, constantly learning and evaluating as we go through. And you have to have champions. That's the other lesson we learned. This takes human resources. This is not something that people can do as a side job. It's something that really having dedicated staff, and what we've seen, those missions who have actually put staff on the ground, often they are our AAAS fellows, several missions actually hired integrated specialists. And when they are on the ground in Uganda, in Rwanda, they're the ones who are bringing the teams together, and they're doing the prep for that, the thinking on the strategic side, but they're also doing the follow-up, because as we know, so much of the work just keeps on going. And so having teams that are really, really dedicated to this. And then obviously the importance of political economy analysis. And again, our DRG team putting that front and center, not just saying we need to look at the political economy of a country, but most importantly, giving all of us the tools in order to do that. So with DRG, just, one of the examples, I don't know if it was highlighted today, but it always caught my imagination, that when they started out saying, okay, intentionally, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve a problem? And one of the things we were just talking about recently back in South Africa, not even in the Ronald Reagan building, but we were saying, as we're looking at development problems, we have to make sure that we're not falling in love with our project, with our approach, with our activity, we need to really be dedicated and falling in love with the challenge we're going to have to solve. And what that means is that something that might look so obvious, and in this case, the Senegal, of looking at the number of registration for children under the age of 14 who had no birth certificates, well, that seems like that would be a pretty easy problem to solve, but not in some of the most deprived conflict areas. Well, what do you need to do in order to solve that problem? You're not just going to look at that through a simple DRG lens of, okay, let's create a whole certificate program, a registration system, we'll get it out there. No, you're going to bring in your health specialists, right? Because those people who are not registered don't have access to the clinics. You're going to bring in your education specialists because those kids who are not registered don't have access to the best educational services. And through that approach, a piloted approach, they absolutely were able to not only increase, which was the initial challenge, the number of registration certificates for children, but more importantly, they were able to see education rates go up, they were able to see health access to clinics go up, and they saw government services, the perception of government services increase significantly. So you're solving a governance issue, you're solving a health issue, you're solving an education issue. So those are just, that's just one example of, again, the importance of bringing different leaders together. Often in our health field, and particularly within USAID, because health is such a specialized area. I mean, you really need to have deep technical knowledge, whether it's on malaria or obviously on HIV/AIDS or family planning or maternal child health. There are, as Gail Smith would say, cylinders of excellence that exist all throughout, particularly USAID. So bringing those different disciplines together, just even within the health sector, is important so that you do have an integrated approach for, most importantly, the mother, the child, the person in that community, in order to access all of those services within a simple way. An example of that is in the Lake Victoria Basin, our HOPE program, bringing together our environmental experts, our family planning experts, our health experts, our food security experts, in order for them to look at, again, their community in a more integrated way to solve the issues of access to healthcare, but also those healthcare issues that are caused by environmental problems with lack of food security, all of that coming together. And as you can tell from the examples I'm giving, and you all know this, it's so much of it is geographic. And so one of the things that being very key to our success is that we have to have that integration occurring around geographic areas. Not always, but just mapping out where the different activities are happening, getting the right people in the room, having them solve the problems. I could go on and on for different issues from water, the Key Wash program in Kenya that was built on the success of a project that we had in Indonesia, access to safe water that obviously led to greater health improvements, reached 2 million people in Indonesia, taking that model that DAI and the partners developed with USAID, bringing it to Kenya, and building it into a business model. Again, the local sustainability, creating 200 different types of business applications in order to solve very much a local problem. So it's happening out in the field. So I'm going to skip forward a bit because there are lots of great examples out there, but I want to talk about what we need to do. And I hope that provokes a little bit of discussion and comments and things that you've been thinking about throughout the day for you to also share with us in USAID that you think we need to be focusing on. So I will just name a few, because if I went through the whole list, we'd all walk out of here like, oh my gosh, there's a lot to do. But I hope that energizes everyone. But one thing that has definitely risen to the top of our agenda is we need more adaptive, flexible management systems, practices in order to obviously be learning, to be making those changes as we see needed at the community level. So iterative planning. And we're very much trying to pilot many of these iterative planning tools through our Global Development Lab, but I just want to share with you that we are building that into our mainstream policy planning guidance that we're sending to the field. We are, all of you know, we're trying things such as doing the broad agency announcement much more, having partners really share and collaborate. And we know that's hard for you because your knowledge, your intellectual property, if you will, your experience is very much attached to your organization. And so all of this involves the second thing I'm talking about, which is risk. It really, to do true integrated development where we're co-designing, we're iterating, we're learning, it involves all of us taking some risk. It involves us collaborating and sharing way for USAID. It obviously involves us saying we don't have all the answers. And that's often very difficult sometimes for the lead development agency to say, we don't know the answer, we know the problem, and then let's really work together in order to share to solve that problem. But we also know that creates challenges for you on your side. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we address that. We also, often we talk about the issue of needing the flexibility in funding. I mean, that's so true with almost every area we work in, but definitely integrated development because our funding is so obviously not only just earmarked, but we have initiatives, we have a lot of restrictions on our ability to move money around. And so the issue with pooled funding and how do we actually really develop support for pooled funding moving forward. And I think we're seeing some real progress in that area, and what we're doing is trying to highlight those areas where it worked. And then we're also trying to say, we tried pooled funding here, but it didn't work, and here's why, and here's how we should fix it moving forward. You know, clearly the need for greater I don't want to say guidance, because if any of our field missions who are here say we have enough guidance from Washington, but what we hear is we need tools, we need training, we need much more of a laser focus on this so that the field and all of you working out there feel as though you're given the tools in order to be successful. And that this becomes, frankly, just a core part of development and core part of training for all of our officers and all of us who are working within this field. So I guess I will just leave you with a couple questions and open up because I see the clock is running. So questions for you. How do we institutionalize integration? You probably heard we have an election coming up. It's about 4 months and 28 days away. And so while there's a lot of momentum behind this, we've also seen momentum behind this issue before, and then it sort of fades into the background and then it comes back up. So institutionalizing this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Incentivizing integration. How do you, and some of you have worked in USAID as I look out at the crowd, some of you have always been partners and whatnot. What do you see that works to incentivize integration? We have ideas we're batting around within USAID, and we would love to hear it. Host country governments, and how do we really encourage them as well? Every government, every country is a little different. I have my thoughts from obviously having incredible partners in Colombia, very progressive on this subject, always believed you had to have everybody at the table and think about it in an integrated way with markers. But then also, how do you evaluate success? What does success look like in an integrated program? Another real challenge for us. So I'll stop. I could give you a long laundry list of questions and issues, but I hope at least to hear some of your thinking. And again, just want to thank you for all the work that all of you are doing on this issue, because as we know, we are not going to succeed as a development community and really achieve the vision of the SDGs without a more integrated approach. So thank you.
So Susan is very happy to, in fact, more than happy, hungry for some questions. So if you just raise your hand and announce who you are in the organization that you're from before you ask the question. Thank you.
I know it's 5 o'clock and everyone's like, I'm exhausted.
I'm going to start if no one else will, because there was, in our last session, someone over here made a comment that if only Congress would change the way it funds USAID.
Yeah.
Is that really the root
Yeah.
of getting integrated development right?
Well, it's a great point, because I think all of us, particularly now who are back here in Washington, feel the frustration of the earmarks, and as well as with the initiatives, and feeling as though our funding is really tied. But interestingly enough, we did do some analysis of this recently. And some of you may have been at CSIS a while back when we were talking on a panel. Patrick Fine was actually on the panel from FHI 360, and Diana Obam, who had worked on the Hill for years. And we talked a lot about the issue of earmarks. And even with earmarks, and I'll give you the reason why I mentioned the KeyWash program, and I probably should have highlighted this earlier. KeyWash is 40 million WASH earmark. I mean, that's a set earmark, but it's also 10 million of Feed the Future funding. And they were able, again, based on the experience of Indonesia, how do you blend that type of funding and actually achieve the larger goals of access, clearly to clean water, but also food security issues, and using a private sector approach. So it can be done, and I think that's why we shouldn't give up as easily at times and say, well, everything's earmarked and an initiative, we can't do it, because there's some great creative programs out there doing it.
Okay. Other questions, reactions, comments? Yes, Ben.
My question for you about power within USAID, and how you think it can take, well, because integration is great. All our organizations would love to integrate. But actually, there's lots of vested interests, there's lots of power dynamics within the organization. I know we're related with the USAID, but we know that there are dukes and duchesses that run large parts of the organization. They've got an incentive to keep that the way it is. So how do you diplomatically disrupt those power structures? Because I think that's something we're all have to do.
No, it's a great point, because actually I think one of the reasons why DRG is often seen first in the limelight on the integration front is people say, well, they didn't have any money. They didn't have an initiative. They only had certain earmarks that really marked them. But what happened was, again, going back to, if we even just take it out of all the different baskets of funding, we said when we did our policy framework as an agency in 2011 to 2015, we chose 7 principles, and one of them was integration. Because we all knew, taking off your DRG hat, your education hat, your health hat, that to achieve really the goals that we had set out, we have to integrate. I mean, it's just good development. It's a development discipline. But then it got tough, right? Because then all of a sudden, as you said, everyone then goes back into their bureaus or offices and their technical area and says, but I have to achieve results, and I have to achieve results really quickly now, for example, maybe in Feed the Future or ending preventive child maternal death. And they're saying, well, yeah, maybe it was the DRG people who, they just need funding, and that's why they're coming over for this. But what happened in that span of time, which I think was brilliant, was the case studies. The case studies within those 6 countries, and having mission leadership stand up and do that, and then looking at the lessons learned, and most important, looking at the results. That just helped all the other sectors, all of the other bureaus, definitely within the Ronald Reagan Building, but absolutely within the missions, see if we want to achieve long-term sustainable development and our goals, we have to work through the local system, and we have to look at it in a more integrated way. So it became a development discussion as opposed to a funding or a mechanism discussion. That would be my thought. Debbie. Great to see you.
I have the benefit of knowing a little bit about the background, but following on Ben's question, Susan, struggling with the silos that we often find in terms of host countries, and thinking back to Colombia, what could we replicate from your experience of Colombia? What kind of consultation or information is being shared with ambassadors and others who are main interlocutors about getting government ministries around the table?
Yeah.
Like the health and education together, or
Right.
the private sector trade minister.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Yeah, reflecting back on that, so we talk a lot about the development silos of excellence, right? And the technical area, but what really struck us in Colombia was because it was Plan Colombia, and there was so much funding that was going in, as you well know, from so many other sources. And it was literally one day when the Mill Group commander, myself, and the head of the political econ section we're on a trip with the ambassador, and we sort of, he was putting up his newspaper trying not to talk to us, but we were all talking about the problem in that area and saying, we can't just limit our tools and silo them, we have to bring them together. And so the first thing we did, and if this is helpful, I think we often do it in organizations, we mapped it out. We had everyone just come and just start putting on the map who was doing what where. But then most importantly, we said if we're going to attack the problem within this area, we have to do it in a more integrated, and I would use the term sequenced, because often, and particularly if you're dealing with some really difficult issues, if you're doing everything at the same time, as we know, local capacity, particularly at the community level, is pretty thin. There are a couple people who everybody's trying to get the meetings with, everyone's working day and night with, and so you really have to sequence your tools. We have to sequence our tools as we're going in there as a community. And then most importantly, and you just raised this, Deb, I think it's a great reflection that we often talk to different ministries solo, and it does help when you have the Presidencia, and we were very fortunate to have someone in Acción Social who was sort of the coordinator for all of the development activities, but then we also brought in the Ministry of Defense. And so you had the Presidencia, you had the Ministry of Defense, you had sort of the head of the development community. And we would literally go through and look at, and this is where the monitoring and evaluation I think is absolutely key, because you can be sequencing it, but as we know, in particularly conflict zones, everything changes every day. So we'd have to really, be very careful about monitoring. Okay, that worked really well on the landmine removal. We're ready in this zone to go quickly to working with the prosecutors, working with the community, the communities to bring them to a different level, whereas this community we're not, and we would red, yellow, green. And when things weren't happening in a ministry, it really helped to then have, and this was all very well coordinated, I mean, not always simultaneously, but with our ambassador and with the ministries, that when things didn't happen, we just were calling each other all the time, and then they could pick up the phone and call, hey, the Ministry of Justice, why didn't that, Justice House get built, or why isn't this funding happening and whatnot? So the intentionality of always being focused on what's the problem we're trying to solve, who's doing what, how do you integrate, and this does require host country capacity. And I know we obviously do not have that in many of the countries where we work, but there are those change agents. So bringing them into this process, because ultimately, in order for this to sustain, in order for your work, our work to sustain, they have to not only be at the table, but they have to be leading it. And sometimes it's going to be frustratingly slow. It's not going to be at the pace that Washington wants, or maybe even we want when we're in the field, but it's worth the extra time and building the processes and the systems and the feedback loops for that continually to happen. So I'd really put a big emphasis on systems and processes, feedback loops, because if you don't get that right, you're kind of always in a sense of a bit of chaos.
So we have time for one more question. Greg.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Greg.
So participants today have learned a lot about the work of USAID around integration at so many different levels, at the mission level, the pillar bureaus, the regional bureaus, and there's a lot of champions. And so, sort of like in symphony terms, I think like the horns are strong, the strings are coming up, and the percussions are there. But is there a symphony conductor within USAID? And if not, do you think that would be worthwhile having someone who's really kind of orchestrating and bringing it together?
Yeah, that's a great way to sort of capture and probably to end this, because I think we are at a point, and not just within USAID, but I would imagine in many of the partner organizations and whatnot, how do you really make the orchestra all come together? And we're, I think, at a point where we're looking at how do we make this not just another forum or more case studies and more, but really have intentionally a group that is dedicated and with guidance. At this point in the administration, to be frank, we're not going to be appointing any more coordinators or, but I think it's a real area that for the transition team, and as we're doing our list of issues for the transition, I think this will rise very much to the top of the agenda. So, thank you. Oh, well, there we go. That's a happy squeal to end on.
Thank you so much on that note.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.